special shout out. I want to give a special shout out to Ed Aguilar. I'm not even sure if Ed's on yet, but he will be at some point, and he was a co-founder and still is the co-chair of that campaign. We are also grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Ministry for the Earth at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Princeton, and our first speaker, who I'll introduce momentarily, is a member of that church. Before I do introduce that first speaker, I want to give you a short overview of how we're planning to conduct this webinar. We've got three world-class speakers lined up, and as you listen to them, you'll have the opportunity to submit a question at any point. You're going to do that by going to the chat box and selecting me. You're only able to send a chat message to one of us who are co-hosts, which is myself and the speakers, and Danielle Williams, our executive assistant, but please choose me to send your question to. And then as the speakers go along, I will be looking at those questions and beginning to think about the best ones to ask and whether we can combine some of them, that kind of thing, to be as efficient as possible. After our last speaker, we will go directly into the question and answer period, and we'll do as many as possible before we end at 3:30. With that, let me introduce our first speaker, and I'm very honored to do so. Dr. Robert Harris has a PhD in environmental sciences and engineering from Harvard University. After a faculty position at Princeton University, he co-founded a consulting company that helped industry and government clean up contaminated sites, including Department of Defense sites such as the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado and the dioxin contamination on the Passaic River right here in New Jersey. That was caused, of course, by Agent Orange, which was used during the Vietnam War to defoliate the jungle there. So with that, Dr. Harris, take it away.
Thank you very much, Reverend Moore. I had the honor of serving President Jimmy Carter as a member of his Council on Environmental Quality. One of my responsibilities was to help shape the administration's response to the Superfund bill that was before Congress at that time. President Carter signed the Superfund bill into law in December of 1980, which started a decades-long effort to clean up sites that pose the greatest risk to human health and the environment. The current list of priority sites numbers over 1,300, of which 600 are military sites. During my consulting career, my colleagues and I work with industry and the government to figure out how to clean up many of these sites, including dozens of military sites. Prominent among those were the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado, the Lockheed site in California, and the Passaic River in New Jersey, all a byproduct of war efforts. The US Army constructed the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in 1942 in response to Pearl Harbor. Its purpose was to develop chemical weapons as a deterrent against the Axis powers. In those days, waste disposal was an afterthought, especially for the military, which had one and only one objective at sites like Rocky Mountain: produce as much weaponry and other war materials as possible, as quickly as possible. Consequently, waste was haphazardly discarded into lagoons and landfills, which began seeping into the groundwater and continues to do so to this day. Recently, the state of Colorado sued the Department of Defense for continued contamination of the groundwater in the Denver area. My colleague who worked on this site for years was retained by the Army to serve on an expert panel to review the remediation work at numerous other military sites to improve the efficacy of cleanup. At each of these sites, the story is essentially the same. From Fort Detrick in Maryland to Fort Ord in California, from the Alabama Redstone Arsenal to Iowa munition plant, from Camp Bullis in Texas to Fort Dix in New Jersey. A legacy of conventional, chemical, explosive, and in some cases, even nuclear waste, posing environmental threats decades after they were produced. Many of these military sites were originally located in rural, relatively unpopulated areas that have now been developed so that people are living next door to former Army landfills and lagoons, increasing the risk to public health. At the Lockheed site in Burbank, California, which was the manufacturing site where most of the military planes were made to support our efforts during World War II, Lockheed and many surrounding industries that manufactured parts for these planes contaminated the groundwater of almost the entire San Fernando Valley, which supplies drinking water to nearly 1 million people in Southern California. The cost of cleanup has been staggering. The groundwater will remain contaminated for decades to come, since the cost of complete cleanup is nearly prohibitive and may not even be technically possible. You may remember that our military used Agent Orange to defoliate the jungles of Vietnam to help expose our enemy, the North Vietnamese. Agent Orange contains the herbicide 2,4,5-T, and unfortunately, an unintended contaminant of 2,4,5-T is dioxin, which is the most toxic carcinogen ever tested. A number of sites nationwide manufactured 2,4,5-T for use in Agent Orange, including the Diamond Alkali plant in Newark on the Passaic River. As a consequence, dioxin contaminates the sediment and wildlife over a 17-mile stretch of the river and Newark Bay. The solution so far has been to dredge the sediment and dispose or treat it off-site. My former firm has been intimately involved in helping to shape the cleanup effort, and one of my partners has helped resolve the claims made by our Vietnam veterans whose health have been compromised by their exposure to Agent Orange while fighting in the jungles. These are examples of past environmental damages from our war efforts and preparations for war. They do not include damages to our environment on the battlefields around the world, as we are now witnessing in Ukraine as the Russians lay waste to fuel oil, gasoline, and jet fuel storage and manufacturing sites, not to mention the debris from destroyed buildings. They do not include unexplored ordnance, weapons that did not explode or can still pose a risk of detonation decades after they were used or discarded. UNICEF estimates that worldwide, abandoned landmines kill or injure 15,000 to 20,000 people a year, predominantly children. Based on these environmental insults to air, soil, and water are ones we are most familiar with from past war efforts. But what about the effects of war and the preparation for war on global climate change? Arguably one of the greatest environmental threats the world faces, perhaps second only to all-out nuclear war. I noticed that an excellent article last Tuesday in the New York Times titled, "Nature is often a silent victim of war," did not mention the potential impact of war and the preparation for war on climate change. We hope today to rectify that omission. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. That was a very good hands-on beginning for our time together. And let me go on to introduce our second speaker now, Professor Neta Crawford. She is the author of the forthcoming book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions. And she's also co-director of the Eisenhower Study Group, Costs of War, and she is a professor of political science and currently chairs Boston University's Department of Political Science. Professor Crawford.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you very much for letting me join you today. I'm going to talk about some really big issues, some of which have actually been covered by Dr. Harris. What I want to do, though, is begin big and then sort of zero in on some very specific things. And I don't know if you can hear that shrieking child in the background. I'm staying in a hotel in Milwaukee. I can't control it. Hopefully they'll get the child. Meanwhile, let me just say a few words about the larger ecology of war. We've always hurt the environment in war, sometimes deliberately. For instance, when the Hittites sowed some of the land with salt that they'd conquered. Then there have been at times regulations against environmental degradation. So as when the Hebrew Bible in Deuteronomy prohibited cutting down fruit trees, but in the prohibition to cut down fruit trees, it's acknowledging that other trees may be cut down during a siege. During European wars of conquest in the Americas and elsewhere, in fact, even in European wars on the continent of Europe, there would be chevauchés where there'd be the burning of wide swaths of land on either side of an advancing column of knights and others. In the Americas, the burning of crops and orchards of Native Americans, and in fact, the deliberate burning of forests was part of the conquest. So, for example, during the Civil War, this continued. The United States cut down trees to make corduroy roads, tents, and barriers, and they sometimes had to replace railroad ties using the woods that they cut down. And I could go on and on with specific examples during these wars, but I do want to go back to the Philippines for a moment. From 1899 to 1906, the United States, of course, was engaged in first a war of conquest and then a counterinsurgency war in the Philippines, where much of what happened was the cutting down of forests in order to expose the land, much as the United States did during the Vietnam, so that they could find guerrillas. The motto of the Vietnam War destruction for the defoliation was, "Only we can prevent forests." That's what the people who were deploying these chemicals said. Then, of course, there's nuclear weapons testing and use from 1945 through the 1960s, the above ground testing, and to a certain extent underwater and underground testing led to the release of radioactive material and including fallout. Not to mention the tests in the far west of the United States that and the uranium mining associated with the production of nuclear weapons that's already been mentioned. So what I want to do now is just give you a little snapshot of the environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine. Some of the primary consequences, of course, are the operations of military vehicles leads to fuel spills. In particular, jet fuel is toxic and penetrates groundwater. There's dust churned up by heavy vehicles. And there's carbon dioxide then is a greenhouse gas that comes from the operation of aircraft and diesel-powered vehicles, as well as any gasoline-powered vehicles. Now, in the US military, it's the aircraft which have the highest levels of emissions. And it looks like fewer aircraft are being used than one might have expected in the war in Ukraine. So it might be that the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions in the Ukraine will come from the land war. But I'm not sure yet. We don't know yet. Then there's, of course, the destruction, the combustion, the particulate matter that is thrown into the atmosphere, not just carbon dioxide, but toxic chemicals such as asbestos and lead and mercury. Then there's the methane that is released from the targeting of oil and natural gas facilities, other fuel depots. Then there's been apparently some nuclear releases from Chernobyl, some radioactive releases that were not scheduled or anticipated, and a little spike in gamma radiation. I will know more about that, of course, after the war. Then there's ground and surface water contamination. There was the destruction of a fertilizer facility, and that has released ammonia and nitrates into surface waters. Then there's the secondary pollution as people compensate for the loss of power and the destruction of power plants. So they burn fuel that they wouldn't normally burn, such as diesel, to generate electricity, or they cut down trees for fuel and for the barriers that they need. Then there's the long-term and wider effects of the war in the Ukraine, which is increased mobilization of NATO and then therefore increased emissions from them. And any other country that increases its military spending is likely to increase its emissions. Now, I want to focus on an area where I've recently finished a book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, and just spend a few more minutes specifically talking about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. In the 19th century, Eunice Foote and John Tyndall discovered that carbolic acid and carbon dioxide would increase the temperature of a place where it's contained. And this, of course, led to the science of climate change, which comes into fruition in the 20th century. So all the work done by Foote, Tyndall, Arrhenius, Callendar, et cetera, is actually focused by the United States military. And in particular, Roger Revelle, who's a very important climate scientist, was funded, he was a member of the US Navy, an officer in the Navy who did research in the Pacific during the nuclear weapons tests there, but he was also a climate scientist who in 1957 and 1956, 1957 asked for Congress to increase funding of the effects of carbon dioxide. And his work, as well as the people who are funded by this research, leads to a much better understanding of the consequences of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So much of the work, the way that we understand the effects of greenhouse gases was funded by the Department of Defense, and in particular by the US Navy in 1990, working on the implications of global warming for the Navy and then all the other services. Of course, on the other hand, in 1997, the United States military worked hard behind the scenes and then later in public to keep greenhouse gases that were produced by the military out of the Kyoto Protocol, so that the emissions from the US military would not be counted. They wanted a blanket exemption for the military. What they got was an exemption for counting bunker fuels, that is fuel that's stored abroad, used abroad, and some emissions inside, so you could actually not have to report, unless you wanted to, your emissions. And this blanket basically exemption, it's almost a blanket exemption, was challenged in 2015, and now militaries can, after Paris, voluntarily say what their emissions are, and then, but they generally don't. And then in 2021 at the Glasgow meeting, a number of people, and myself included, tried to help spark mandatory reporting of military emissions, and we'll see where that effort goes. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the specific link between war and climate change. So, on the one hand, the military has been a large user of fossil fuels from the moment that they moved away from sail to steamships, and used coal for not just the steamships, but later railroads. And then they also powered military industry. So what you see is that surface ships of the submarine fleet and trucks and tanks and aircraft in World War I allowed, as Lord Curzon said, the Allies to float. He says they floated to victory on a wave of oil. And this dependence on oil for the military has obviously increased since then. At the same time, there was a concern about access to oil. And the specific concern is, can we get the oil, that is, the militaries get the oil that we want at the price that we want, and can we prevent our adversaries from obtaining that oil? So In war, what you see, especially in World War II, is the targeting of the adversaries' oil production and storage facilities. And you see this in the 1991 Gulf War. You see it in the war in Ukraine. So part of the effort and the consequence of being at war is the effort to deny and to control access to oil. So you might have arrangements with, as Nazi Germany did, with Stalin to provide oil, or with a Middle Eastern country to provide oil, and you may not, in other times, want to have an alliance with this power, but they have this fuel that you need. So that's on the one hand, this demand, and then the attempt to control demand. And then there's the military industrial side of it, which is the military industries, of course, need fuel. They use, in the 19th, 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, they often used mills and ran by water, but increasingly they used coal and then oil. So military industrial emissions are a significant portion of any country's emissions. And my calculations that I'll be publishing in the new book show that military industrial emissions are on a scale on par with military emissions. So I've published some figures that are now public, and done some calculations showing emissions and military emissions in any one year, let's say 1975, when they were about 100 million metric tons, are correspondent with military industrial emissions, and they also fluctuate with war, depending on what the United States is doing at any one time, or any country doing it at any one time. So when the United States withdraws from Vietnam, US military emissions go down. The Cold War buildup, they went up. Post-Cold War, they went down, except for 1991, when they reached a post-1975 peak. Then they declined through in the post-Cold War period until the 2001 beginning of the war in Afghanistan, they increased. So in other words, military industrial emissions and military emissions fluctuate with war. That's my sense. And this is not surprising. On the other hand, however, the United States and other countries have been diminishing some of their capacity in a permanent way. In other words, through base realignment and closure, some military bases have closed, and that's diminished the amount of fuel used and emissions, therefore, from some bases that are now used for other things or closed entirely. So the military has continued since the 1950s and 60s, however, to have a concern about climate change that they talk about more or less openly, except for the Trump administration. So their concerns are that climate change will cause the United States military to be distracted and will detract from its main warfighting mission, because the US has to respond to climate change disasters. For example, when National Guards and active duty troop were used in California to fight wildfires, or when they've been used to go rescue people due to flooding from hurricanes and other events. So their concern is that it will detract from training and operations and readiness. The other concern they have is, of course, to their infrastructure, their facilities, their installations. So the rising sea level will inundate certain ports, which then will have to raise the piers and so on. There's also the concern about operationally, the concern about decreasing salinity, changing the capacity to do anti-submarine warfare. So there's some very technical things that they're concerned about, and some sort of opportunity costs that they're concerned about. And then the third area that they're concerned about, of course, is that climate change may lead to conflict. And I would say this is a very complicated thing, and I'm going to just try to simplify it as much as I can, because what we're hearing is that climate change caused conflict is coming to a neighborhood near you. That's what we're getting. And this, I believe, is heightening and, in fact, threat inflation from climate change to cause conflict. It's not impossible that climate change will exacerbate conflicts that are ongoing. They have. It is not impossible possible that people will fight over resources like water, but it turns out that most water resources are resolved diplomatically or through treaties, even with countries that are at war or have bad relations. It is possible that climate change caused migrants will come to your border, and in fact they have. But this does not mean war. But what the DoD has done is to focus on these sources of instability and argued that we must be prepared. And in the specific DoD documents, they suggest that, until quite recently, they suggested that these are possible, that the conflict is a possible consequence. But if you listen to what people are saying in the military when they're speaking in public, they're much more direct about a link between climate change and conflict. Now, the academic literature on this, the people who've studied this for the last 30 years, is actually not clear that there's a direct causal link. But this bears more research. Of course, we can't wait for all this research. We have to, I believe, decrease military emissions as part of the effort to decrease emissions overall, so that if it is true that climate change will cause people to fight over resources, we should try to diminish the consequences of climate change. Preparing for climate change caused war is much more likely to cause consequences that we'd rather not see. So I'm not in favor of using the military to respond to or to prepare for climate change caused conflict. The other thing that they talk quite a bit about are threats from what they call revisionist powers, powers like the Chinese or the Russians, who would like to take advantage of climate change caused instability. And they will, for instance, move into the Arctic and take resources. Or they will they'll seed the atmosphere so that it changes the climate. And these are concerns which could be dealt with preemptively, proactively, through negotiation and treaty. So I think we have to beware of the militarization of climate change. The final thing I'll say is that the Biden administration, thank goodness, has taken this seriously. You'll see much of their documentation of the threat of climate change, at least by the Military National Security Council, Department of Homeland Security, and the White House in general, is very clear. They understand the consequences of climate change. They understand the necessity to diminish emissions, that is mitigation. They have announced a whole of government effort, but unfortunately, in December, as part of the whole of government effort, the Biden administration also said that national security institutions don't necessarily have to reduce their emissions. They have an exemption. So I would end there then with this caution that the military says it is greening, that it's using alternative energy, that it's greening the supply chain. I think this is a welcome development, but it is not as rapid or as deep a change as I believe is both possible and necessary.
Thank you so much, Professor Crawford. I thought that was really outstanding and excellent overview of the challenges that we're facing. And I'm really looking forward to your book coming out too, by the way. I want to be one of the first in line to get it for sure. We're going to go on to our next speaker. And before we do, let me just mention a few helpful links have been posted in the chat box for you to see. There are links about some of the experts that Dr. Crawford was just mentioning, but also to the web page for this event in case you want more background on any of our three speakers. Also, so far, I'm not getting questions, and I'd like to get some good questions. I have some of my own, but I definitely don't want to dominate. So Please be submitting your questions as our third and final speaker on this panel goes, and I'll introduce him now. That is Professor Alan Robock. He is a distinguished professor of climate science in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Rutgers University, where he is the co-director of the Rutgers Impact Studies of Climate Intervention Lab. In 2017, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons, end quote. And that was based partly on the work of Professor Robock. Professor Robock.
Thanks so much, Bob, for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the environmental consequences if nuclear weapons are actually used. This picture behind me is the pyrocumulonimbus, the big thunderstorm generated over Hiroshima by the fires. This picture was taken 3 hours after the atomic bomb was dropped there, and the amount of energy in the fires was much more than the energy of the bomb. And this pumped smoke up into the stratosphere where it lasted for a long time and caused climate change. So, you know, I'm a science professor, so I'm going to use a PowerPoint. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk about nuclear war instant climate change and its impacts on global famine. I first want to start to acknowledge that the namesake of Rutgers University, Colonel Henry Rutgers, owned slaves, as did many of the early presidents of Rutgers College, now Rutgers University. Slave labor built the Rutgers campus. The land on which Rutgers sits was stolen from the Lenni Lenape natives, and Rutgers benefited from the Land Grant Morrill Act, which allowed New Jersey to sell land taken from Western Native Americans for the benefit of Rutgers. We've become much more aware of these things recently, and there's a whole report about it at Rutgers. The work I'm talking about is done by some of these old guys. This is Rich Turco, Brian Toon, Tom Ackerman, who wrote the first paper on nuclear winter, me, and Georgy Stenchikov, who wrote the first paper by the Russians. And the work by the Russians and the Americans together helped to end the nuclear arms race. I also, as Bob mentioned, I run this risky lab, and these are my students here and my two postdocs. And we're working on how climate change by putting particles in the upper atmosphere could affect crops. And we publish lots of papers about it, which you can download from my website if you want. Now, here's the story. Here's our beautiful planet. But after a nuclear war, it might look like this, with clouds of smoke covering it, blocking out the sun and making it cold and dark at the Earth's surface. So the climate change is caused by the smoke from the fires that would be started by nuclear weapons. And if there's enough smoke, temperatures would get below freezing even in the summertime. And we call that nuclear winter. It would be cold, dry, dark, and also the smoke would destroy ozone, which would let more ultraviolet radiation reach the surface. And this could produce global famine if there was enough smoke. So here's a graph of the total number of nuclear warheads on the planet. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons now, but only 2, Russia and the US, have more than 90%. And you can see the number was going up, and then the arms race ended. Why? Well, there was a paper by Paul Crutzen and John Birx who pointed out in 1982 that the fires, as Neta mentioned, would put all kinds of pollutants into the atmosphere, the bombs, and this would affect ozone. But there would also be smoke from fires. Oh, by the way, that smoke might cause climate change. And nobody had thought about that before. And then a Russian group and an American group both calculated how much the climate would change. And the result would be nuclear winter. And then I did a paper and another group did, and then the arms race ended. Another idea about why the arms race ended was the end of the Soviet Union, but it didn't end for 5 years later. So the Soviet Union, the arms race was already over. There were also massive protests, the SANE campaign, massive protests in democracies about fear of nuclear weapons and helping to end the arms race. But that was because it was really important to people then. And today people have other things that are on the list of what's important: the pandemic, my job, the price of gas, my lack of health care. And so unless people organize and protest about it, I think there won't be as much pressure as there was then to end the arms race. I also want to point out that although the number's been going down, there's still 10,000 deployed nuclear weapons. So there's still plenty of nuclear weapons on the planet. Now, how do I prove that we helped to end the arms race? Well, you just ask the people that made the decision. Ronald Reagan said a great many reputable scientists are telling us that such a war could end up in no victory for anyone because we could wipe out the earth as we know it. Think back to natural calamities, volcanoes. We saw the weather so change. There was snow in July in many temperate countries, and they call it the year in which there was no summer. Now, if one volcano can do that, we're talking about, what are we talking about with the whole nuclear exchange, nuclear winter? And the other person was Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in charge of the Soviet Union. He said models made by Russian and American scientists showed that a nuclear war would result in a nuclear winter that would be extremely destructive to all life on Earth. Knowledge is a great stimulus to us. So that was 40 years ago. Why am I even talking to you about it? Well, as I mentioned, the Cold War and the arms race are over, but could the remaining nuclear arsenal still produce nuclear winter? And what about the use of a much smaller number of weapons in a regional nuclear conflict? We've studied perhaps a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, but if the Russians use nuclear weapons in the current conflict with Ukraine, and there's a response by NATO and it gets out of hand, we could still have a regional nuclear war in Europe, or it could turn into a global nuclear war. And the answer to this is yes, we can still produce nuclear winter. It would last for a decade. And if there were could everybody mute, please? I heard somebody, thanks. And it wouldn't be nuclear winter if there was a lot less smoke, but still it could be a huge impacts on agriculture, which I'll show you. And the direct effects, of course, would be horrific. Now, I want to remind you, at the end of World War II in 1945, the US burned cities in Japan. It was their policy to send out incendiary bombers and burn cities. And they burned 69 different cities every 3 days or so during the whole summer. It took fleets of bombers with incendiary bombs, starting with Tokyo, but the last two that they bombed were Nagasaki and Hiroshima. 69 cities, those were the 68th and 69th cities to be burned. So that policy was already well underway. And so they killed 800,000 innocent civilians, 800,000. With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it only took one bomb each. That was the only difference. And in Hiroshima, a 15 kiloton bomb killed about 150,000 people. This is the airplane that did it, the Enola Gay. I took this picture at the Hirshhorn facility at the Air and Space Museum. This is a mock-up of the uranium bomb, the front and back half of the plane. It's now on display out by Dulles Airport. The picture on the left is the mushroom cloud made by the bomb. And the picture on the right is the one I have behind me, which is the pyrocumulonimbus cloud 3 hours after the attack from the fires that were started. This is a drawing done by one of the survivors. They remember the fires. And here's another one. And this is what Hiroshima looked like afterwards. All the buildings burned. So it's the fires started from nuclear war that could cause global climate change. 3 days later, we dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, and this is what Nagasaki looked like. Now, it doesn't take nuclear weapons to burn cities. Fortunately, we have very few examples of this, but here's one. In 1906, there was an earthquake in San Francisco. Jack London wrote about it. He said, within an hour after the earthquake shock, the smoke of San Francisco's burning was a lurid tower visible 100 miles away. And for 3 days and nights, this lurid tower swayed in the sky, reddening the sun, darkening the day, and filling the land with smoke. I watched the vast conflagration from out on the bay. It was dead calm, not a flicker of wind stirred. Yet from every side, wind was pouring in upon the doomed city, east, west, north, and south. Strong winds were blowing upon the doomed city. The heated air rising made an enormous suck. Thus did the fire of itself build its own colossal chimney through the atmosphere. So we have these examples of smoke being pumped up into the stratosphere by burning cities. San Francisco after the fire. Now, there are about 13,000 nuclear warheads on the planet today. This is a graph made by the University of Nagasaki. Each icon is 5 bombs, 5 on land-based missiles, submarines, aircraft. The gray ones are on the shelf, retired. And this is Russia, the US, and this is the other 7 countries. It's kind of hard to see, so let me blow it up. China, 350, France, 290. So each of these countries has a few hundred nuclear weapons. North Korea has 40. Why do the US and Russia have so many thousands? There aren't enough targets anywhere in those countries to use these on. Why do they have so many? And why do the other 180 countries in the world have 0? Why? What can we learn from that? Now, here's a satellite image from the space station. And this orange line here is a border between 2 countries. And this is India and this is Pakistan, the Indus River. And these bright lights are huge cities, probably some you've never heard of before. Hyderabad, Faisalabad, millions and millions of people. And India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. So we asked 15 years ago, what if India and Pakistan had a nuclear war? Until the last month, we thought this was probably the most likely place on the world for a nuclear war to start. In Kashmir, there are all kinds of skirmishes. And you may remember about a month ago, India launched by mistake, a cruise missile into Pakistan. Fortunately, it didn't start a nuclear war. Fortunately, it didn't harm anybody, but what kind of control do they really have over their arsenal? So imagine a skirmish there escalating due to poor communication, misunderstanding, panic, and fear. And so we calculated how much smoke there would be from each side using 50 nuclear weapons. They each had about 100 in their arsenals at the time, small ones the size of Hiroshima. And this is where the smoke would go. On the right is a map, and on the left is the atmosphere. This black line is called the tropopause. We live down here in the troposphere where there's rain and weather, but the smoke would be heated by the sun, lofted into the area called the stratosphere where there's no rain, and it would be blown around the world and last for years. And if we plot the global climate change, this blue line is global warming. And of course, it's a serious problem and we have to solve it. But it's gradual climate change. Nuclear war would produce instant climate change. And this is only from 5 million tons of smoke from a small war between India and Pakistan. It would be so much cooling that it would be unprecedented in recorded human history. But, you know, it's much worse than that. This is a Trident submarine. It has about 100 nuclear weapons, and they're much bigger than the one dropped on Hiroshima. So each one is as powerful as 100 Hiroshimas. Before I showed you the effects of 100 Hiroshima worth of smoke, this has 1,000 Hiroshimas, and there's 14, and that's less than half of our arsenal. So we have maybe 25,000 Hiroshimas, and Russia's got the same 50,000 Hiroshimas, not 100 Hiroshimas. So what would happen if the US and Russia had a nuclear war? It would produce so much more smoke. And again, it would cover the world and block out the sun. And we did these calculations 15 years ago, and we looked at how the temperature would change a year after the war. These are in degrees Celsius. So minus 30 degrees Celsius is minus 35 is minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And we wanted to see with this modern climate model, was it really nuclear winter? We just by chance happened to pick a place in the Ukraine, the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. And so this is a graph of the surface temperature at the minimum daily temperature. The black line is without war. So in the summer, temperature gets to 20, 25 Celsius, 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It gets below freezing in the winter. But with all this smoke, temperatures will plummet below freezing, 0 is freezing, and stay below freezing for at least a couple years. So clearly that's nuclear winter. You couldn't grow any crops at all. Now, Pakistan and India have a sort of a mini arms race going on. They each have 160 weapons now, and they're increasing. And they also have now more powerful weapons than we assumed before, and their potential targets are larger. So we did a study a couple of years ago. What would happen if India and Pakistan had a nuclear war in the near future? And that could produce 16 to 36 teragrams or million tons of smoke. And here's a graph of the temperature change. So for the blue is the case I showed you before, 1 or 2 degrees cooling. The green is a US-Russia war, 10 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Fahrenheit global average cooling. And for 5 years, it would be nuclear winter for sure. And in between are what we think maybe India and Pakistan could do now. If you plot this on the global warming, I had to rescale it. This is what I showed you before. This is 50 million tons of smoke, maybe from India, Pakistan, 150 million from US, Russia. Just want to remind you, 20,000 years ago, when there was an ice age, when mile-thick ice sheets covered North America, the global average temperature was 5 degrees Celsius colder. So this is ice age temperatures instantly. So the most important thing is how would that affect food? That's the most important impact of climate change. Second is water. It would be darker, it would be colder and less rainfall, and this would all reduce agricultural productivity. And we studied that with our crop models. These other impacts we haven't studied yet. We have a paper that's into review now in the journal Nature Food, so I want to show you some of those results. Lily Shaw, my colleague, has done most of the work. And we use a model to calculate how would each of these crops, maize, corn, rice, soybeans, wheat, grasses, change in each country, and how would fish change? Because if you can't go grow crops, can you go fishing? And we looked at livestock. Some of them eat pasture, some of them eat crops. We feed them, and so we looked at all the distribution from every country. And we used Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO data, to look at every country. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but we calculated how many people would starve after all the food that's stored is used up. And we tried to live off of our what we could grow. And we made this assumption every country would stop trading. They would hoard the food like we hoarded toilet paper a couple of years ago. And that if people, and even if people, some people got no food and some people got enough to just barely stay alive. At the end of 2 years, for an India-Pakistan war, this was with data from 2010 when there were almost 7 billion people in the world, 2 billion people would die. And for a US-Russia war, 5 billion people would die. So most of the world could die from starvation. It doesn't matter whether you continue to feed the animals or you consume them and eat all the food that they could eat. It doesn't make any difference at all. Now, all that's theory. I'll show you a couple things that happen in the world that we use to test our theory. The seasonal cycle, it gets cold in the winter. You block out the sun, less sunlight, it gets cold. Less sunlight at night, it gets cold. I already showed you that cities can burn. What about the climate effects? I'm just going to show you a couple examples. We know the asteroid Ampek killed the dinosaurs. I'm going to show you forest fires and volcanoes, which Ronald Reagan mentioned. So a couple years ago in Canada, there was a big forest fire that pumped smoke into the stratosphere. And we used the same climate models we used for nuclear winter to calculate what would happen. And it turned out the smoke plume rose in the stratosphere by being heated by the sun, observed by satellites. So let me just show you one graph. For 10 days after the smoke was put in, it lofted into the stratosphere. The dashed lines are from our calculations, the solid lines are from observations. Lasted for months. And 3 years later in Australia, 2 years ago now, there were much bigger forest fires. You may have heard about them, horrific. It burned the eucalyptus trees, and that put 3 times as much smoke up, and it also went up 20 kilometers. Now here's the Tambora volcano that caused the year without a summer that Ronald Reagan mentioned. It in Indonesia, and this is a graph showing the temperature in New Haven, Connecticut for a couple years after that, observations. The temperature went down by many degrees. And a recent book written about it by Gillen Wood said, for 3 years following Tambora's explosion, to be alive almost anywhere in the world meant to be hungry. There was famine in the US, in Europe, in India, and China. So a nuclear war between any nuclear states using less than 3% of the current arsenal could produce climate change unprecedented in human history. Such a small nuclear war could produce global starvation with massive increases in ultraviolet. The current arsenal can still produce nuclear winter if the US and Russia have a nuclear war. So how do you feel? I took this before they told me to put my camera away. It's really a bummer. What do you do with this information? As Mark Twain said, the natural reaction is to forget I told you about it. Go home, turn this off. But he said denial ain't just a river in Egypt. But my reaction is to try to do something about it. I want to prevent something like this from happening. So the only treaty that still exists is the New START treaty between the US and Russia, which limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons. It was signed by Obama and President Medvedev in 2010, and it was extended by Presidents Biden and Putin in last year, so it's going to extend until 2026. It allows about 4,000 nuclear warheads to be deployed strategically. But as I showed you, that's enough to produce nuclear winter. You can still produce that much smoke from a war today with the current arsenal. And there are many additional, what we call tactical nuclear weapons that aren't covered by the treaty. Now, here's some good news. This is a map of the world. All the places in blue have no nuclear weapons. There's no nuclear weapons in the Southern Hemisphere. There's only 9 countries with nuclear weapons. The US, England and France, and 6 in Asia. But the ones in yellow have a treaty with the nuclear nations and think that they're protected by a nuclear umbrella. Even Japan won't criticize nuclear weapons, even though bombs were dropped on them. And the US has actual nuclear weapons, NATO weapons, actually in Turkey, Italy, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. There's about 100 there. So these countries which have the nuclear weapons say they're for deterrence, but they don't deter attacks by conventional weapons or terrorists or pandemics or cyber warfare. All these examples, the Yom Kippur War, the Malvinas War, Afghanistan, Vietnam, the countries with nuclear weapons in red didn't win. Oh, but we're trying to deter an attack by other nuclear nations. Well, that's right. There has not been a war between nuclear nations since the first nuclear war 77 years ago. But why? Was it deterrence, or was it a general decline in violence, increased number of democracies, these international organizations? And if you believe in deterrence, it has to work perfectly. There can't be any mistakes. And there have been many cases where we came very close. So this is a picture of one of the 36 that's given by the Russians to Cuba. I took this in Havana. The 3 regiments arrived in Cuba with 36 rockets with 36 nuclear warheads. Each one was 77 times more powerful than Hiroshima. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we also almost had a nuclear war. On October 27, 1962, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. A submarine almost launched a nuclear torpedo, a Russian submarine. A U-2 spy plane entered the Soviet airspace, but fortunately, President Kennedy and President Khrushchev pulled back. Our blockade worked. We took our nuclear weapons out of Turkey. I had the surreal experience of going down to Cuba and talking to Fidel Castro about it. And for 3 hours, he talked to me across the table, telling his whole life story. And he said, you know, the Russians, every day a ship showed up with supplies for us. So when they wanted to put nuclear weapons here, what could we say? But when the ban treaty came, Cuba was one of the first countries to sign it and say we don't need nuclear weapons. This was a Rutgers baseball cap I brought as a present for him. Now, President Kennedy understood this 60 years ago. He said, every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. 1961, 60 years ago. Every president since then has not done anything about it. They've reduced the arsenals went up and went down, but still, President Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize and said he wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, but he didn't. President Biden said he wants to take away the power of the president to have the sole authority and the putting all the all the options on the table, but the nuclear posture review, which he organized, which is about to be released, doesn't change our nuclear posture. So presidents have the power, but they haven't done it. Martin Sherwin said, nuclear armaments create the perils they are deployed to prevent, but are of little use in resolving them. And that's the real lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I think we should take our US land-based missiles off hair trigger alert, give up the sole presidential authority, change our policy to no first use, get rid of our land-based arsenal. There were a series of conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons that led up to this treaty to ban nuclear weapons that Bob mentioned. I went to the one in Mexico, and the UN banned nuclear weapons in 2017. And now came the hard part, getting the countries to sign it. But a year ago, it came into force in January 2021. 50 countries had signed the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. The number is now up to 60. The Nobel Peace Prize went to ICANN, as Bob mentioned. When Beatrice Finn accepted the Nobel Prize, she said, the story of nuclear weapons will have an ending, and it's up to us what the ending will be. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons, or will it be the end of us? One of these things will happen. The only rational course of action is to cease living under the conditions where our mutual destruction is only one impulsive tantrum away. This was 5 years ago when Kim and Trump were arguing about whose button was bigger. But maybe, did she plagiarize from John Kennedy? That's what he said 60 years ago. So, policy conclusions. Nuclear weapons can be used if they exist. A nuclear war could start tomorrow by accident, hackers, computer failure, bad sensors, or unstable leaders. Nuclear arsenals did not deter attacks from non-nuclear states, terrorists, or pandemics. The only way deterrence could work is if states believe that other states are willing to kill themselves by using their nuclear weapons. Because if we attacked another country with our nuclear weapons, we'd all die from starvation. So it would be an action of a suicide bomber. If there's a guarantee there will be no unintended use, the only way to prevent a global catastrophe is actually to get rid of the nuclear weapons. So Carl Sagan, who was one of the authors also of the first paper about nuclear winter, was asked, he was a great scientist, a great climate communicator, and died at age 62, unfortunately, much too young. So Carl, don't you want to keep our deterrence? He said, well, for myself, I would far rather have a world in which the climate catastrophe cannot happen, independent of the vicissitudes of leaders, institutions, and machines. It seems to me elementary planetary hygiene as well as elementary patriotism. So I think elementary planetary hygiene demands we eliminate nuclear weapons much faster than the current pace. So I hope we can learn from this and keep our planet looking beautiful like this for a long time to come. If you want more about this, you can go to my webpage. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Robock, for a truly outstanding presentation. It was clear. I loved your PowerPoint. I think it was powerful. It covered all the important points. Really great note to end on. And thanks to our previous two speakers too, who gave also outstanding presentations. I think we are so fortunate to have these deeply knowledgeable people and deeply committed to having us have a livable world for ourselves and our children and grandchildren. So I'm excited. I'm really pleased with the quality of all three of these talks. And thank you so much. Let's show our appreciation to all three of our speakers.
Thanks.
So we have a number of good questions, and I'm going to start with them here in just a moment. Okay, here we go. All right, I know the first one was about the politics of this. And okay. With the current level of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere, might not a nuclear war push the levels beyond the tipping point and cause runaway greenhouse effect, resulting in the Earth becoming like Venus? I think that's probably for you, Alan.
Yeah, no. We've calculated how much smoke you would get from the fires, how much carbon dioxide from the burning. And no, it wouldn't put that much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In fact, people have asked me the opposite question. Wouldn't nuclear winter be a good solution for global warming? because it would cool it off so much. And so I did a calculation what would happen, and it would civilization would basically stop, and all the industrial pollution that we have, we wouldn't be able to get oil and natural gas, and there would be a huge reduction of emissions. So the amount we put in every year incrementally increases the CO2 that's already there, but the additional amount from the war wouldn't produce that much.
Thank you. Let me go to another question. I think this might be from my daughter, who is studying ecology at Rutgers, by the way. Some ecologists may hesitate to get political in their efforts to promote sustainability. It sounds like the military is the elephant in the room. Would it be harmful, helpful, or neither to include war and military in the discussion about the climate crisis? Who would like to comment on that question?
I will, but Neta, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think that the military would like us to believe that they're leading in responding to climate change. And to a certain extent, some of the research that they sponsored was extremely useful. But when you have, let's say, the United States military, whose emissions are on par with the country of Portugal annually, or Sweden, or Denmark, and you have military industrial emissions that are on par with those countries' annual emissions, that's not an institution that we can expect will be useful. The technologies that they could produce or innovations that they could make are of marginal utility in this sense. The technology that they, for instance, could develop with batteries or fuel efficiency is it's baroque. It's too useful for military purposes when we have almost all the technology we need from commercial research. So I wouldn't want the military leading us to the green transition that we need. That's just, to use a bad word, overkill. Commercial, that is civilian technology, would be much better suited to making a rapid transition, if I understood the question correctly. I hope I did.
Yeah, there's enough wind and sun on the earth to power the whole earth with solar panels and windmills, and we just need a little bit better storage and better ways to transmit it. And so we don't need we don't need them to help. We need them to get out of the way and stop emitting CO2.
All right, thank you. I have a couple of questions now specifically for Professor Crawford. One questioner is asking you to comment on something from Senator King's website. He's one of the two senators from Maine, as you know. Here it is. It starts with a quote from him. "The Arctic is an emerging frontier for international commerce and military capabilities required to protect national interests, which creates new opportunities for the U.S. If you want peace, prepare for war."
Right, so that's been said since 1957. And the person who said it in 1957 was Roger Revelle. And that was his argument for doing more research on climate change. There is a group of civilian scientists and policymakers who've been working on making the Arctic zone that we could all use for scientific research and for commercial purposes. Yes, it could be open to submarines 24/7, 12 months a year, shortly. But we can choose whether or not to militarize that space. I think militarizing it actually just leads to more militarization of the space, and we're better off not. The resources that could be gained from an open Arctic can be gained for the most part elsewhere at lower cost. So I don't see that the Arctic will necessarily drive conflict, though this is an old concern.
And if we melt the Arctic, there's going to be so much other terrible consequences of climate change around the globe, we really don't want to do that.
Well, we're on our way. You know, Alan, I think we're well on our way to most of the worst consequences of climate change. What we're trying to do right now is to not reach the most horrific. And I think there is going to be open water in the Arctic. There will be sea level rise. There will be, you know, many of the worst consequences of climate change, but we can actually move to sequestration, that is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and we can move to a much quicker transition to alternative fuels, and we could be preventing the most horrific consequences. Climate change will kill people. It already is. What we have to do is look at places like the military where emissions do not have to be so high. They can be reduced immediately with a change in policy. And so I think we just have to accept that some of these consequences are on their way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the solution to global warming is to leave the fossil fuels on the ground and switch as quickly as we can to renewable sources. We're up against two massive power centers, though. It's the fossil fuel industry and the military industrial complex, and they make lots of money and have armies of lobbyists going to Congress telling them other things and giving them money so that they can run for re-election. And it's very frustrating fighting against that, but that's what we're up against.
Thank you. Professor Robock, I have a question for you now, and then I see one in our chat box for Dr. Harris as well, which I'll get to after that. Do you have any comments on nuclear power? After Fukushima, some Japanese anti-nuclear weapons activists that I know also sought to highlight the threats posed by nuclear energy. I'm just curious if any research on the risks, if you have any research on the risks related to nuclear power.
Yeah, how long do you want me to talk about that? I'll make it short. Nuclear power has many things wrong with it. We develop incredible amount of radioactive waste that's sitting next to power plants. We don't know what to do with it, and it's not very secure. Not like the domes where the reactors take place. The mining of uranium for it is really dangerous to miners. It allows nuclear proliferation. That's how India and then Pakistan, North Korea got their nuclear power, got their nuclear weapons. And so it leads to proliferation. It's very, very expensive. And the US government gives them subsidies and insures them against accidents. And solar panels and wind is much cheaper and much faster to implement. So we don't necessarily have to shut down every nuclear power plant today, but I don't think we need to build anymore. People claim that there are new designs that will be safer, and maybe there are, but I think we should do research on it, but that will be decades from now before they're ever implemented. And so we don't need nuclear power to solve the climate change problem.
Okay, thank you. I happen to agree with that strongly. Dr. Harris, in Maine, the Brunswick Navy Air Force Base is now closed, but it is leaking PFAS, PFOS, all in caps, into the public water supply and into the nearby community wastewater system, which has been for years been working with farmers to spread wastewater sludge for free all across Maine, which has now been found to have severely polluted farm products, lettuce, squash, etc. Consequently, Maine has legislated that sludge can no longer be spread on fields. And this year legislated that no one can discharge PFAS, but the Navy is still doing it from their base. How do communities hold the Navy accountable?
I wish I knew the answer. I think that only through citizen action and demonstration and protest, Reverend Moore, you know all about how effective that can be. And PFAS is just I started working on a project the very first time I think that it entered our consciousness in West Virginia, where there is manufacturing, a DuPont manufacturing site. And it has gotten progressively more of a horror story every year since. So many compounds in that category, and they're right that sewage sludge used in Maine has shut down farms up there, but it can't be unique to Maine. There's got to be many other locations. I know when I haven't seen this exactly in a site or a plant in the United States, but when I was working in Germany years ago, the wastewater treatment plants had a hose out of their sludge basins that farmers would drive up with their carts and turn on the spigot and get sludge and go and put it on their field. So it's a practice that's been used for decades. And we have at least one product called milorganite, which is a processed sewage sludge that is commercially sold as fertilizer or as soil amendment and it has been for decades in this country, coming from sewage sludge in Milwaukee. So,
Where I'm sitting.
Pardon?
I am sitting in Milwaukee, and I thought of milorganite and the problems that the people here have had to try to stop it.
But I think the regulatory agencies, we always point to the regulatory agencies and say that they've got to address this, but it's a slow process, and it makes me weary to think of how much we've tried to get addressed PCBs and dioxin contamination of Kanawha River and Passaic River and so on, and it just has taken forever to do it. So I don't have a good answer for how quickly this can be done.
Okay, thank you. Wouldn't it be, here's two that I'm going to group together. Wouldn't it be more economical to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than it would be to adapt to and/or mitigate climate change? And along with that, what policy changes would immediately dramatically reduce the military's contribution to climate change?
Well, about the cost, the question is to whom? The fossil fuel companies make a lot of money by selling these fuels that people are addicted to. And so but other people pay the consequences of climate change. So globally, of course, it would be better not to cause global warming, and everybody on the planet would benefit by rapidly switching to solar and wind. The prices of them are decreasing very quickly. But because people continue to sell us the drug and make money from the addiction, and they use their profits to keep federal subsidies as well as get rid of regulations, and they completely control one whole political party in the United States, that's what we're up against.
I'll
Thank
just say
you.
that.
Oh, go ahead. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
I wanted to address what the military reduction profile would look like. I think there are three things that could happen. First, the military aircraft are, when you look at the military's profile of emissions, the largest greenhouse gas contributor. And one thing that could be done is, of course, increase the efficiency of the aircraft. And that happens very slowly because the arsenal changes very slowly, and it has been occurring. But simply grounding most planes, reducing exercises, the aircraft emissions are also associated with high levels of water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor itself is a greenhouse gas, so it's important to decrease aircraft operations as much as possible. That would have a significant impact immediately. Then what's been happening is that bases and installations have been transitioning from coal, though the military is still the only US government department which has coal-fired plants, and moving toward more natural gas and other renewable forms of energy production. But the renewables are only about 2 or 3% of military energy use. And of course, the US military is the United States government's largest energy user, and hence the United States' largest single energy user. So reducing energy use at installations is important, and energy use by fossil fuels has been declining. But I think this transition to natural gas, which they've been doing, which has helped them reduce their energy consumption by moving away from coal, is important. But natural gas itself is its global warming potential is much higher than carbon. And so if they want to green, it's better to close installations rather than to switch to natural gas. And in fact, we should all be moving off natural gas, because natural gas is 24 times higher global warming potential, and it stays in the atmosphere much shorter period of time. We could have an immediate reduction in emissions if we switched off of natural gas and onto renewables. And that means, that would have a ripple effect, stopping leaks from the production of natural gas. And we could also actually reduce methane emissions by reducing agricultural emissions. There are many things we could be doing, but those are, I think, high priority. Now, somebody also was asking about nuclear power. The US military is talking about, and in fact, I think planning to purchase very small nuclear plants, and some of them will be mobile. I think we should keep our eyes on the ball. I'm not sure how that's going to go, and if we're really going to do it, but this is something that they've been interested in, and I think are getting funding for in this current fiscal year.
And Professor Crawford, while we're on you,
Excuse me, Bob.
a chat question, I'll get to you in a second, is your new book still on schedule for release on October 4th?
Well, I'm sitting here with the page proofs, and it a little bit depends on me.
Okay.
But yes, it's on schedule. I'm looking for typos right now. Well, not
Great.
right now, but presently.
Well, some of us are obviously anxious for it to come out. So, Professor Robock.
Yeah, great. It's great that you're publishing a book. I want to publish a book too, so I want to ask you later how to do that. But I just want to make a couple climate science responses to what you said. Methane is a very strong greenhouse gas if it leaks, but if you burn it, it produces less CO2 than if you burn coal to get the same amount of energy. So it's the leaks from the methane that are really the problem, and from fracking. And about water vapor is the strongest greenhouse gas, but emission of water vapor doesn't cause climate change because the atmosphere controls the amount of water vapor. If there's too much, it rains. If there's not enough, you get evaporation. So the relative humidity stays about the same no matter how the climate changes. And so emission of it, we don't restrict water vapor emissions from driving our cars. That's what mostly what comes out of the tailpipe, because the atmosphere controls the amount of water vapor, and 70% of the world is ocean, and there's an infinite source of water vapor for the atmosphere. So burning things and emitting water vapor it might produce a slight change in the amount of clouds. If you fly airplanes in the upper atmosphere, the cirrus clouds cause a little bit of warming, but a tiny amount. So,
well, that's what I'm referring to, Alan. It's the high altitude release of water vapor, and there's new science on that you might be interested in.
Okay.
Great. Is there anything about, or are any of the three of you involved in something that this questioner is asking calls just transition? Is there anything that any of you are involved with in that regard?
Well, I can say a few things about a just transition. Um, well, there are really a couple of elements to it. First of all, when you make a change, for instance, decrease the amount of coal that's being mined, of course, the people who had those jobs need to find other work. They'd like to find other work, and that's partly what just transition is about. But it's involving the people themselves, the coal miners in this example, in determining the ways that they will make a transition. There also needs to be a just transition around military bases, and some of this has occurred. There is work on military industrial transitions, which is involving members of military industries, workers in military industry, about how to make a transition. There's also the question of climate justice, which we haven't talked about, which is where, for example, I mentioned the uranium mining pollution. Well, if you drive from the Grand Canyon to the middle of Navajo Reservation, you will drive by uranium tailings. The pollution is obvious on the reservation. There's also pollution in poorer neighborhoods, which is associated with production of weapons. And I'm sure Robert Harris can tell us more about this, but the idea is that those who have the least capacity to have a say about what is sited in their neighborhoods, that is the poor, minorities, uneducated people in rural areas, have suffered the most from the consequences of the effects of having military industries, which are highly polluting. But that's a story with non-military waste and production as well.
Dr. Harris, Professor Crawford thinks you might have something to add. Would you like to add anything?
I wouldn't add anything, only to agree. And in my career, it's just shocking how many of these sites are near communities of color, indigenous populations, both for the reason that it's easier to site a facility when the public has little political clout, but also over time those adjacent areas are less costly to live in, so they attract low-income groups. But that's not an excuse. That's just simply what has happened, and I agree with what she says.
Okay, I'm going to put out one final question, and then we'll have some closing remarks. Ray Nichols, if you could send me a message in the chat box whether you'd like to still say anything in closing, that would be good to know. But the question that I want to ask as our last question is from the co-founder of our No Wars, No Warming campaign, Ed Aguilar. What grade would you give the Biden administration, and what should they do immediately on clean energy?
I guess it depends on what scale. Compared to the last administration, they're doing much better. On the other hand, right now, because their politics get mixed in with what the long-term right solution is. People are upset about paying too much for gasoline. So Biden has released more fuel from our strategic reserve and allowed more drilling, which over a long period of time may or may not produce more greenhouse gases. But overall, I think they're doing a pretty good job with respect to global warming.
Okay, Professor Crawford?
I think it's a C. And it's not because I'm afraid of grade inflation. F would have been my grade for Trump.
Yeah, for sure.
F minus. But because that was an utter distraction. But why is C for Biden? Biden says many good things that I agree with. Remember, President Biden was on the Senate Armed Service Committee when there were hearings about Kyoto, and he applauded the exclusion of military emissions from the Kyoto Protocol. He and John Kerry were absolutely in favor of that omission and exemption. And so I think it's ironic that they're in charge. I'm happy to see that in some ways they've changed their tune, but in other ways they haven't, because as I mentioned, the December executive order about a whole government approach to climate change excludes national security, right? It says that the heads of the national security agencies can ask for an exemption from the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other part of why I give them a C is the military budget, which is going higher. And, I said that military emissions are correlated with military activity, that is, operations, but it's also correlated almost perfectly with military spending, right? What we need to do is reduce military spending and release those resources for more productive activities. And to my mind, what the Army has done in saying that they're greening and that they're hanging onto their forest and therefore sequestering, all of that's fine, but it's not enough. It's not deep enough. The Army, for example, has promised that they'll reduce their emissions by 50% from 2005. Now, when they tell you from 2005 and that they'll reduce their emissions by 50% in 2030, what they haven't told you is that they've already reduced their emissions about 40%, right? So they don't give you the baseline number. And, so I think there's a lot of nice marketing going on. And I agree it's much better than the previous administration, but they need to be pushed. And I'm happy to be part of that movement, your movement.
Well, thank you, Professor Crawford, and we are great to be partners in this effort. I do have one final question. We may make us go a minute or two over, but before I give that question, I did want to point out several people have asked about the recording for this event. It will be on our peacecoalition.org page under recent events, probably within a day or so. And we'll be trying to proactively send this out to all of you as well. I think this has been a truly outstanding webinar. Yes, let's give one final round of applause. And then I do want to close with this one final question from Ray Nichols of the Ministry for the Earth at the Unitarian Universalist congregation. He asks about the role of absolute energy reduction, that is conservation of energy regardless of source. Do any of you want to comment on that?
Well, mitigation involves less. To be happy, we want stuff. If we want less stuff and less use of energy, that will be part of mitigation. Part of it is using energy more efficiently by insulating our houses, for example, and part of it is switching to the sources of energy. So all of those are part of the solution.
Great. Either one of the other two of you want to say anything? Go ahead, Dr. Harris.
I would strongly agree with what Alan just said, and remember that energy efficiency is the cheapest, absolute cheapest way of conserving energy.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your spending the time with us. I'm very proud of this webinar and our being a co-sponsor of it. I think these were all truly outstanding presentations. And Alan, I think also the question was raised about your PowerPoint. So if you're willing to have us include that in what we post, you can think about it, okay?
Oh, sure. I'll send you a link to it and you can post it along with the.
That would be super, because that was a superb PowerPoint, really superb. All right, so thank you all again for a wonderful spending this time with us in a wonderful conference, a wonderful webinar, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, bye-bye.